They thought the heat would kill her. They thought the albino Omega was too broken to survive, too defective to matter, too cursed by the moon goddess herself to deserve saving. But they were wrong. The three Alpha paramedics weren't looking for a patient that night. They were hunting for their mate. And when Ivory Winters collapsed on the floor of her tiny apartment phone, clutched in trembling fingers, dispatch operator's voice, a distant echo in her burning ears, she had no idea that one emergency call would change everything. 60 days from that moment, she would stand before 200 witnesses with her head held high. Three massive alphas would flank her sides like living shields, and the man who once called her worthless would kneel at her feet. But first she had to burn. First she had to survive the wildfire consuming her from the inside out. First she had to trust three strangers with more than her life. She had to trust them with her soul. This is how it happened. This is how an outcast became irreplaceable. This is how destiny found a girl the world had given up on. 6 months before the heat that would alter the course of Ivory Winters' existence, she stood in the center of the Shadowmere Pack gathering hall, with 200 pairs of eyes judging every inch of her pale skin. The autumn air carried the scent of pine and damp earth through the open windows. Torches lined the stone walls, casting dancing shadows across faces she'd known her entire life. Faces that had never quite looked at her with acceptance. Faces that saw her white hair and colorless skin and decided she was the moon goddess's mistake before she'd even learned to shift. 19 years old and Ivory had learned to make herself small. She stood now with her gaze fixed on the worn floorboards beneath her feet, hands clasped in front of her plain gray dress, shoulders curved inward as if she could fold herself into nothing and disappear from the weight of their collective stare. Alpha Valen Blackthorn stood on the raised platform at the front of the hall. 30 years old, broad-shouldered, with dark hair threaded with silver at his temples and eyes the color of aged whiskey, he commanded attention the way mountains commanded respect. Inevitable, immovable, absolute. He had been her father's best friend once. Before the accident, before the sickness took both her parents within a year of each other. Before Ivory was left alone with nothing but a sister who resented her existence and a pack that tolerated her out of obligation. Valen's voice carried across the silent hall with the kind of authority that made even the strongest wolves drop their eyes. The matter before us tonight concerns Ivory Winters. She flinched at the sound of her own name, hated the way it sounded in his mouth. Clinical, formal, like she was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be seen. 19 years old, presented as Omega at 18, unmated, unbonded. He paused and Ivory could feel the weight of what came next pressing against her ribs. Albino. The word hung in the air like an accusation. Whispers rippled through the gathered pack, not loud enough to be called disrespectful, just present enough to remind her that she would never truly belong here. Defective, cursed, the moon goddess's mistake. She'd heard it all before. Had learned to let the words slide off her skin like rain off stone. But tonight felt different. Tonight something in Valen's posture suggested this public gathering wasn't just tradition. It was a trap. As Alpha of Shadowmere Pack, it is my duty to ensure the well-being of all our members. Valen's gaze swept the room before settling on Ivory with an intensity that made her stomach clench, particularly those most vulnerable to the prejudices that still exist in our world. A woman in the front row nodded. Seraphine Silvercrest, 26, beautiful in the way that made other wolves stop and stare. Dark hair that cascaded down her back in perfect waves. Amber eyes that sparkled with confidence and certainty. She wore a dress of deep emerald that probably cost more than Ivory made in 6 months working at the PAC's community center. Seraphine was everything Ivory wasn't. Powerful bloodline, social connections, the kind of Omega that Alphas fought wars over. She was also, Ivory knew from years of carefully observed pack dynamics, the woman Valen had been courting for the past year. The solution, Valen continued, his voice carrying that same inexorable certainty, is clear. Ivory Winters needs the protection that only an official mate bond can provide. The status, the security, the guarantee that no pack, no alpha, no wolf can discriminate against her without facing consequences. Ivory's head snapped up despite her instinct to remain invisible. No, the words screamed in her mind but died on her lips as Valen's gaze locked with hers. Therefore, I am formally proposing an arranged mating between myself and Ivory Winters, to be completed within the next full moon cycle. The gathering hall erupted. Voices overlapped in a cacophony of shock and speculation. Some wolves nodded in approval. Others exchanged glances that spoke of scandal and impropriety. Seraphine's face remained perfectly composed, but Ivory saw the flash of something cold and sharp in those amber eyes. Fury. Betrayal. Possession denied. Ivory's pulse hammered in her throat. Her hands had gone numb. The torchlight seemed too bright, suddenly the room too small, the air too thick to breathe properly. This couldn't be happening. She'd spent the last year since presenting as Omega carefully constructing a life of independence, working 2 jobs, saving money, planning her escape from Shadowmere to one of the neutral cities where shifters and humans coexisted. Impact politics didn't dictate every aspect of existence. An arranged mating would destroy all of that, would trap her in a bond with a man who saw her as a duty to fulfill, a problem to solve, a promise made to a dead friend that needed keeping, regardless of what she wanted. Valen raised one hand and the hall fell silent, with the kind of obedience that spoke to years of unquestioned authority. "I understand this is unexpected," he said, and there was something in his voice that might have been genuine care if Ivory could get past the roaring in her ears. "But Ivory's father asked me before he died to watch over his daughter, to keep her safe. I gave him my word. This is how I honor that promise," her father. The memory of him rose sharp and painful. Marcus Winters had been kind, patient, had told her stories about ancient white wolves blessed by the moon goddess when other children called her cursed, had promised her that being different didn't mean being less. But he was gone, and his best friend was using that old promise like chains. Ivory found her voice somewhere in the depths of her terror and rage. "No." The word came out smaller than she wanted, barely more than a whisper. But in the silence of the gathering hall it carried. Valen's expression didn't change. "Ivory, you don't understand the danger. Unmated Omegas with your condition are vulnerable. Other packs see you as prey, and as something to be claimed and controlled. This bond would protect you. I don't need your protection." Her voice was stronger now, steadier, fed by years of swallowed words and suppressed fury. "I can take care of myself." "Can you?" Seraphine's voice cut through the tension like a blade. She rose from her seat with fluid grace, turning to face the gathered wolves rather than Ivory directly. "An albino Omega working minimum wage jobs in a pack that tolerates her out of pity. What happens when you're in heat and alone? What happens when a rogue alpha decides that unclaimed Omega is fair game? What happens when your defect makes you a target?" The last word hit like a physical blow. Defect, said out loud, in front of everyone, by a woman who had never spoken directly to Ivory before tonight, but clearly had opinions about her existence. Ivory's sister Isla stood near the back of the hall, 22 years old with the same dark hair as their mother, and none of the genetic quirk that had marked Ivory as different. She met Ivory's desperate gaze for just a moment before looking away. The message was clear. You're on your own. You've always been on your own. "I don't want this," Ivory said, forcing herself to meet Valen's eyes, even though everything in her Omega instincts screamed to submit to the Alpha's will. "I don't want an arranged mating. I don't want to be your duty or your obligation or your dead friend's daughter that you have to fix. I want to make my own choices." Something flickered in Valen's expression. Surprise, maybe, or respect. Hard to tell with alphas who'd learned to school their features into masks of authority. "And what will you choose, Ivory Winters?" His voice was softer now, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "What will you do when you're alone in a city where no one knows your name and heat strikes and you have no pack to call for help? What happens when your independence becomes isolation and isolation becomes a death sentence?" She didn't have an answer for that. Didn't have anything except the bone-deep certainty that accepting this bond would kill something essential inside her. Would turn her into exactly what everyone already believed. Weak, helpless, someone who needed to be saved from her own existence. "I reject this proposal." The words came out clear and strong. "I reject this mating. I reject your protection." The hall erupted again. This time the voices were louder, harsher. She heard the word ungrateful snarled from somewhere to her left. Heard foolish girl and he doesn't know what's good for her and let her learn the hard way. Valen's jaw tightened. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of an alpha's command. "You're making a mistake. It's mine to make." They stared at each other across the gathering hall, 200 witnesses to a rejection that would echo through pack politics for months to come. Valen had offered protection publicly, had staked his reputation and authority on this arranged bond, and Ivory had refused him in front of everyone. She'd just destroyed his credibility as Alpha. She'd just made herself an enemy of the most powerful wolf in Shadowmere. And she'd just guaranteed that every wolf in this hall would remember her not as the pitied albino Omega, but as the ungrateful fool who rejected her only chance at safety. Seraphine smiled. It was a small expression, satisfied, like watching a rival dig her own grave brought genuine pleasure. Then this gathering is concluded, Valen said with cold formality. Ivory Winters, you are still a member of Shadowmere Pack under my protection, whether you accept a mate bond or not. But understand this, when you face the consequences of tonight's choice, you face them alone. 6 months later, Ivory Winters pushed through the door of Moonlit Page's bookstore with rain dripping from her white hair and exhaustion weighing heavy in her bones. The bell above the door chimed soft and welcoming. The scent of old paper and fresh coffee wrapped around her like a blanket. Tuesday afternoon in Thornhaven's downtown district meant the usual mix of human customers browsing the bestseller shelves and the occasional shifter stopping in for the specialty section hidden in the back room where pack histories and werewolf lore lived in leather-bound volumes. She'd been living in Thornhaven for 3 months now. 3 months since she'd packed everything she owned into 2 duffel bags and left Shadowmere Pack territory without looking back. 3 months of working 60-hour weeks between the bookstore and a late-night diner shift to afford her tiny studio apartment on the east side of the city. 3 months of independence that tasted like freedom despite the constant exhaustion. 3 months of proving she didn't need Valen Blackthorn's protection or anyone else's pity. The bookstore was quiet today. Rain always drove customers away. Mrs. Chen, the elderly human owner, had left early for a doctor's appointment, trusting Ivory to manage the closing shift alone. It was the kind of trust that still surprised her sometimes, the kind that came from competence rather than bloodline or pack status. Ivory moved through the familiar routine of organizing new arrivals. Her hands worked automatically stacking books by genre and author, while her mind drifted to the small victories that made up her new life. The apartment that was hers alone. No shared walls with pack members. No whispered judgments when she walked down the hall. Just a space where she could breathe without wondering who was watching. The job that paid for her independence. Mrs. Chen had hired her based on a resume and interview rather than pack references. Had looked at Ivory's white hair and pale skin and seen someone who knew how to organize inventory and recommend books to customers, not someone defective who needed special accommodations. The suppressants that worked. Mostly. She took them religiously every morning, had stocked up enough for 6 months. They kept her heat cycles manageable. Uncomfortable, but bearable. Nothing like the stories she'd heard about unmated omegas going into heat alone and losing their minds to the biological imperative. She was safe. She was free. She was exactly where she'd fought to be. 3 days after her 19th birthday, everything changed. The heat came without warning. One moment, Ivory was shelving books in the back room, humming along to the radio playing softly from the front counter. The next fire erupted under her skin with such sudden intensity that she gasped and dropped the hardcover in her hands. It clattered to the floor. She stared at her trembling fingers like they belonged to someone else. This was wrong. This wasn't how heat worked. She'd presented as Omega a year ago. Her first cycle had been uncomfortable but manageable with suppressants and isolation. A week of fever and aching need that she'd weathered alone in her childhood bedroom, while her mother brought meals and cold compresses and carefully averted her eyes from Ivory's shame. This was different. This was a wildfire consuming her from the inside out. An ache so profound it drove the breath from her lungs and sent her stumbling against the bookshelf for support. The albinism made it worse somehow, her pale skin flushed pink with heat that radiated from her core. White hair stuck to her neck, where sweat had already begun to soak through the collar of her shirt. Every nerve ending screamed with a desperate clawing need that had no name and no easy solution. Ivory pressed her forehead against the cool metal of the bookshelf and tried to remember how to think through the haze. Suppressants. She'd taken them this morning. Double dose like always. They should be working, should be keeping this under control, but her body was betraying her. Temperature spiking, heart racing, hands shaking so badly she could barely grip the shelf. And underneath it all, a pull, a calling, like something essential was missing, and her Omega biology had decided now was the time to find it, regardless of logic or timing or the fact that she was alone in a bookstore in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. She needed help. The realization cut through the pung with sharp clarity. This wasn't normal. This wasn't safe. This was the kind of heat that killed unmated omegas if left untreated. The kind where the fever spiked until the brain cooked and the heart gave out and the body simply shut down from the strain of unfulfilled biological imperatives. Ivory fumbled for her phone with fingers that barely worked. Dropped it twice before managing to unlock the screen. The light was too bright. The letters swam in her vision. She squinted at the emergency contacts she'd programmed months ago when she first moved to the city. Thornhaven Shifter Medical Center, the only facility in the city equipped to handle heat emergencies. She pressed dial and prayed someone would answer before she passed out. Thornhaven Shifter Medical Center. How can I help you? The voice was female, professional, blessedly calm. I need help. Ivory's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. I'm an Omega in heat and the suppressants aren't working. I'm alone and I can't control it. Are you in immediate danger? Are there any alphas nearby who might be attracted by your scent? The practical questions helped ground her, gave her something to focus on besides the burning. I don't know. I live alone, but I'm in an apartment building. There are other shifters here. I can smell them through the walls, and if they can smell me, I need you to stay calm. The dispatcher's tone shifted immediately into something urgent and focused. I'm dispatching a medical team to your location right now. Can you give me your address? Ivory rattled off the information, struggled to remember her own apartment number through the fog consuming her mind. The dispatcher stayed on the line asking questions about symptoms and duration and whether she'd had problematic heats before. Every answer seemed to make the woman more concerned. The team is entering your building now, the dispatcher said. Can you unlock your door if you're able? They need access to help you. Ivory crawled to the door, literally crawled because her legs wouldn't hold her weight anymore. The hardwood floor was blessedly cool against her overheated skin. She managed to reach up and turn the deadbolt with the last of her coordination before collapsing against the wall. Footsteps in the hallway. Heavy. Multiple people moving fast. Her door opened and someone was kneeling beside her, and Ivory forced her eyes open even though the effort felt monumental. There were 3 of them. 3 massive alphas in dark blue paramedic uniforms, and they were identical. Triplets. Her heat-addled mind supplied the word uselessly while she stared up at them with something between terror and desperate, aching need. They had dark hair and eyes like molten gold and shoulders so broad they seemed to fill her entire apartment. Scars marked their faces and hands, the kind earned through violence rather than accidents. They carried themselves with the deadly grace of predators barely restrained by civilization. And they were all staring at her with expressions she couldn't interpret, something between shock and recognition and hunger. Omega, the one on the left, spoke first. His voice was rough, like gravel dragged across stone. When did the heat start? Few hours ago. She managed the words despite her chattering teeth. The suppressants didn't work. Nothing's working. The one in the middle was pulling equipment from a medical bag. His movements were efficient and practiced despite the way his hands trembled slightly. He checked her pulse and temperature with fingers that felt like brands against her fevered skin. The touch sent electricity sparking through her nervous system. All 3 of them went absolutely still. She felt it too. That jolt of recognition, that sense of something clicking into place like a key finding its lock. Her Omega instincts roared to life with sudden crystal clarity. Mates. All 3 of them. 3 alphas who could satisfy the burning need consuming her. 3 alphas who could make the pain stop. 3 alphas who could give her body exactly what it was desperately craving. She bit down on her lip hard enough to taste blood, tried to maintain some shred of control through the biological imperative screaming at her to submit. Your temperature is dangerously high. The middle one's voice was calmer than his brother's, but no less intense. This isn't a standard heat cycle. This is a breakthrough heat. Your body is producing too many hormones too quickly. Without proper intervention, you could seize, go into shock, experience permanent damage to your Omega biology. And what does that mean? Fear cut through the haze for a moment. Permanent damage. It means you need an alpha's help to bring the heat down to manageable levels. The third one spoke for the first time. His voice was gentler than his brother's but carried an undertone of steel. It means without proper care, this could kill you. No, she'd fought too hard for independence to die like this, alone in an apartment she could barely afford, undone by her own biology. Another cautionary tale about unmated Omegas who thought they could survive without pack protection. I don't want... She couldn't finish the sentence, didn't know how to explain that accepting help from strange alphas felt like admitting defeat, like proving Valen right about everything. You're not hearing him correctly. The first alpha interrupted, and there was something almost gentle in his rough voice. He means you need our help, specifically, all 3 of us. The words hung in the air between them. Impossible. Absurd. Exactly what her traitorous body wanted to hear. That's insane, she whispered. I don't even know your names. The rough-voiced one with a scar through his left eyebrow spoke first. Thorn Nightshade. He gestured to the middle alpha with slightly longer hair and intensity burning in those golden eyes. This is Zephyr. Then to the third, who was watching her with an expression that seemed to see straight through her defenses to the fear and need underneath. That's Caius. We're triplet alphas. And whether you believe it or not, the three of us are meant for you specifically. Ivory woke to warmth, not the burning fever of heat that had consumed her 14 hours ago. This was different, comfortable, the kind of body warmth that came from three sources surrounding her like living shields against the world. She opened her eyes, slowly testing the weight of consciousness. Her bedroom was bathed in afternoon sunlight that filtered through cheap curtains she'd bought at a discount store when she first moved to the city. The digital clock on her nightstand read 2:17 p.m. She'd slept through an entire night and half the next day. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was that she was clean, wearing a soft t-shirt that definitely wasn't hers, tucked under fresh blankets that smelled like pine in winter in Alpha. Her apartment had been transformed while she slept, the scattered medical equipment gone, the frantic chaos of last night tidied into something almost peaceful. And she could feel them. Three distinct presences in her chest now. Three separate emotions that weren't her own but were somehow becoming familiar. Confusion and wonder and fierce protective instinct that felt like Thorn. Satisfaction and careful planning and vigilant attention that felt like Zephyr. Calm assessment and gentle concern that felt like Chaos. The mate bonds were real. This had actually happened. She'd bonded with three alpha triplets she'd met during a medical emergency, had let them touch her, claim her, mark her as theirs during the most vulnerable moment of her existence. And now they were connected for life, whether she wanted it or not. Panic spiked through her chest. The emotion transmitted instantly through the bonds like lightning through a conductor. Within seconds, footsteps thundered in the hallway. Her bedroom door flew open and Thorn stood there, golden eyes wide with concern, every muscle tensed for violence. "What's wrong?" His rough voice carried an edge of barely restrained aggression. "Are you hurt?" Ivory sat up slowly, clutching the blanket to her chest even though she was fully clothed. "I'm okay," she managed. I woke up and you weren't here. And I panicked." Something in his expression softened. The tension bled from his shoulders. He moved into the room with surprising gentleness for someone so large, settling onto the edge of her bed like he was afraid sudden movement might spook her. "We've been here the whole time," he said quietly. "Zephyr's in your kitchen, making food. Caius is organizing the medical supplies we brought. Neither of them wanted to leave. Neither of them will leave until you tell us to go." The words settled something anxious inside her. She wasn't alone. For better or worse, she wasn't facing this alone anymore. "How are you feeling?" Thorn asked. His gaze swept over her with clinical assessment that was probably habit from years of emergency response. "Any pain, residual fever, disorientation?" "I'm okay," she repeated. "Physically, I'm okay. But I need to understand what happened, why this happened so fast." Thorn nodded like he'd been expecting the question. "Breakthrough heats are rare," he began, and his rough voice took on the cadence of someone reciting medical facts to ground himself in familiar territory. "They happen when an Omega's body recognizes its true mate and decides that suppressants and distance aren't acceptable anymore. Your biology was trying to call us to you. From 5 blocks away." "From 5 blocks away," he confirmed. "We were responding to a different call when all three of us felt it simultaneously. The pull was so strong that we knew immediately. Our true mate was in distress and needed us. We've been waiting our entire lives to feel that pull." Zephyr appeared in the doorway carrying a tray with food that made Ivory's stomach growl in response. Toast and eggs and fresh fruit arranged with more care than simple sustenance required. He set the tray on her nightstand and settled into the chair by her window with liquid grace. "The moon goddess sometimes creates triplet bonds for alphas," he said, picking up the explanation where his brother left off. "It's incredibly rare, maybe 1 in 10,000 births. But when it happens, those alphas are meant to share a single omega. The bond is more stable that way, more balanced. 3 different kinds of strength supporting one center." Caius joined them, leaning against the doorframe with arms crossed over his broad chest. His golden eyes were calm, but assessing. The healer in him cataloging her responses even during casual conversation. "But finding the right omega is nearly impossible," he continued, "because the bond only forms with one specific person. We've been searching for you for 10 years, Ivory. Ever since we presented as alphas at 18. We work as paramedics specifically because It gives us access to the entire city, exposes us to hundreds of shifters, maximizes our chances of finding our mate. And last night you finally did, she finished quietly. Last night we finally did, Thorne agreed. The certainty in their voices should have been comforting, should have felt like fate and destiny, and all the romantic stories she'd read in the very bookstore where her heat had struck. But Ivory had spent too many years learning that certainty from alphas usually meant control disguised as protection. So my heat wasn't random, she said slowly, working through the implications. My body was calling you specifically. Exactly. Zephyr's intense gaze never wavered. Your albinism is part of what marks you as ours. The moon goddess gave you physical traits that we would recognize instantly. White hair, pale skin. Those are signs of a blessed omega in the old legends. Someone meant for multiple alphas. Someone strong enough to handle the intensity of a triplet bond. But I've never felt strong, Ivory wanted to say. I've spent my whole life being told I'm defective because of how I look. The thought must have shown on her face because Chaos pushed off the doorframe and moved closer with deliberate care. Do you know how rare it is for an omega to survive a breakthrough heat without an alpha's help? His gentle voice carried an undertone of steel. Most die within 6 hours. You lasted 4 hours alone before calling for help. Stayed conscious and rational long enough to get yourself to safety. That's not weakness, Ivory. That's incredible strength. The validation made her throat tight with emotions she didn't know how to process. She'd spent so long believing she was less than others, that she needed to work twice as hard to deserve basic acceptance. Hearing 3 powerful alphas tell her she was strong, that she was exactly what they needed, was almost harder to accept than the physical bonding had been. What happens now, she asked quietly, focusing on practical matters because emotion felt too overwhelming. Do I have any choice in this? Or is the bond permanent whether I want it or not? The silence that followed her question felt weighted. Zephyr spoke first, his voice carefully neutral. The bond is permanent. That's the nature of mate bonds. They can't be broken without killing everyone involved. He paused, then continued with surprising gentleness. But Ivory, you have choices about everything else. How fast this relationship develops. Where you want to live. Whether you want to stay bonded to us emotionally or just accept the physical bond and maintain distance. We're not going to force you into anything beyond what's already done. Thorne leaned forward, his rough voice somehow gentle. We know this happened fast. We know you probably feel overwhelmed and may be manipulated by circumstances beyond your control. But we meant what we said last night. You're ours, which means your happiness matters more than anything else. Tell us what you need and we'll make it happen. Ivory looked at each of them in turn, felt their emotions through the bonds, the sincerity, the concern, the bone-deep devotion that seemed impossible after knowing her less than 24 hours. And underneath it all, she could feel something that made her breath catch. They already loved her, not the shallow attraction of wolves who wanted to possess something rare, but deep, fundamental love that the mate bond revealed rather than created. Love that had always been meant to exist between souls the moon goddess had crafted specifically for each other. I want to try, she said finally. I want to see if this can work. I'm scared and I'm overwhelmed and I don't know if I'm capable of being what 3 alphas need. But I felt something last night that I've never felt before. Like I finally belonged somewhere. Like I was exactly where I was meant to be. And I don't want to walk away from that without at least seeing where it leads. The relief that flooded through all 3 bonds was palpable. Thorne's smile was fierce and proud. Zephyr's intensity softened into something warm and hopeful. Chaos's calm steadiness deepened into contentment that felt like coming home. That's all we're asking for, Chaos said softly. A chance to show you what this can be. A chance to prove that the moon goddess knew exactly what she was doing when she created the 4 of us for each other. The first 3 weeks after the bonding passed in a blur of adjustment and discovery. The triplets took turns staying at Ivory's apartment, never all 3 at once, unless she specifically invited them, giving her space to process, room to breathe, the freedom to maintain some semblance of the independence she'd fought so hard to build. Thorne had a habit of appearing with her coffee exactly the way she liked it before she'd even finished getting dressed in the morning. 2 sugar splash of cream heated to precisely the temperature where she could drink it immediately without burning her tongue. She had no idea how he knew, had never told him. But every morning without fail, there it was. Zephyr remembered everything. Every casual comment she made about preferring historical fiction to romance. Every mention of a customer at the bookstore who'd been rude or kind. Every tiny detail of her life that most people forgot within minutes. He cataloged it all with that sharp intelligence and brought it up days later in ways that made her feel seen in a way she'd never experienced. Caius could sense when she was overwhelmed before she consciously registered it herself. He'd appear with tea in quiet company, sit beside her without demanding conversation, let her exist in comfortable silence until the anxiety passed and she could breathe normally again. His presence was an anchor when everything else felt chaotic. They were courting her, Ivory realized, properly courting her despite the bond already being in place, proving that they valued her choice and her feelings beyond what fate had decided for them. Mrs. Chen noticed the changes immediately. "You're glowing," the elderly woman said one afternoon while Ivory was organizing the new shipment of paperbacks. "And you smell different, like pine forest in winter snow." "That's alpha scent, dear." Ivory felt her pale cheeks flush pink. "I've bonded," she admitted quietly. "Recently." Mrs. Chen's weathered face creased into a smile. "Good. You deserve someone who sees how special you are. Don't let anyone tell you different." The casual acceptance made something in Ivory's chest ease. This was what she'd been searching for when she left Shadowmere. A place where people saw her competence and kindness rather than her appearance, where her worth wasn't determined by bloodline or pack politics. Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after the bonding, the bell above moonlit Paige's door chimed. Ivory looked up from the inventory list she'd been checking, customer service smile already in place. The woman who entered was stunning in ways that made people stop and stare. Dark hair cascaded down her back in perfect waves. Amber eyes sparkled with confidence and calculated charm. She wore a designer dress in deep crimson that probably cost more than Ivory made in 3 months. Jewelry glittered at her throat and wrists, the kind of wealth and status that announced itself without words. Seraphine Silvercrest. Recognition hit Ivory like ice water. The last time she'd seen this woman, Seraphine had been sitting in the front row of the Shadowmere Gathering Hall, watching Ivory reject Valen's arranged mating proposal with barely concealed satisfaction. The woman Valen had been courting, the high society Omega who represented everything Ivory wasn't. What was she doing in Thornhaven? Seraphine's gaze swept the bookstore with the kind of dismissive assessment that suggested she found it quaint and beneath her notice. When her eyes finally landed on Ivory, something cold and sharp flashed in those amber depths. "So this is where you ended up." Her voice carried across the quiet store with practiced projection. "The infamous albino who snared the nightshade triplets. I had to see it for myself." Several customers looked up from browsing, human customers who wouldn't understand the undercurrents but could sense tension. Shifter customers who absolutely understood what was happening. A high-ranking Omega publicly challenging a lower-ranked one. Ivory set down her inventory list with carefully controlled movements. "Can I help you find something?" She kept her voice professionally neutral. "We have an excellent selection of fiction and nonfiction. The specialty section is in the back if you're looking for something specific." Seraphine laughed. The sound was musical and perfectly pitched to suggest Ivory had said something adorably naive. "I'm not here for books, dear." She moved deeper into the store with feline grace, examining the shelves with obvious disinterest. "I'm in the city visiting friends. Heard through the gossip networks that you'd bonded with not one, not two, but 3 alphas. The Nightshade triplets, no less. Quite the accomplishment for someone with your limitations." The pause before limitations carried weight. Made it clear she meant defects but was too polite to say it directly. Ivory's hands clenched into fists beneath the counter where customers couldn't see. She forced them to relax through sheer will. Refused to give this woman the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. "The Nightshades are paramedics," Ivory said evenly. "They responded to a medical emergency. We bonded. That's all there is to it." "Oh, I'm sure." Seraphine's smile was all teeth and no warmth. 3 alphas sharing 1 omega is quite rare. Almost unheard of, really. They must have been desperate to accept a bond with someone so unusual. White hair, pale skin, working retail. It's very brave of them to overlook so many obvious disadvantages. The insult was wrapped in concern, but the blade underneath cut deep. Ivory had spent 19 years developing immunity to comments about her appearance, had learned to let words slide off without leaving marks. But something about Seraphine's perfectly practiced cruelty found all the soft places she'd thought she'd armored. Maybe because it reminded her too much of Shadowmere, of pack members who'd smiled to her face while whispering defective behind closed doors, of a life she'd worked so hard to escape. "The Nightshades chose me," Ivory said quietly, "just like I chose them." Our bond is no one's business but ours. Of course, of course. Seraphine examined a display of romance novels with exaggerated interest. I'm sure it's all perfectly legitimate, though I do wonder what Valen thinks about this development. He tried so hard to protect you after all. Offered you everything. Status security, the kind of life that Omegas like us are supposed to want. And you rejected him publicly. Humiliated him in front of the entire pack. That takes either tremendous courage or staggering foolishness. She turned to face Ivory fully now. The pretense of friendly conversation dropped away. What remained was cold calculation and barely disguised contempt. 3 alphas, Seraphine mused. How exhausting that must be for someone so fragile. Trying to satisfy their needs while managing your own limitations. I hope they're patient with you when you inevitably fail to meet expectations. The door chimed again. Thorne walked into the bookstore with the kind of presence that made the air itself feel heavier. He wore jeans and a dark Henley that stretched across his broad shoulders, moved with predatory grace that spoke to years of emergency response training. His golden eyes swept the space cataloging threats with automatic precision. Those eyes locked onto Seraphine with immediate recognition. Then his gaze shifted to Ivory. Saw the tension in her shoulders, the carefully controlled expression, the way her knuckles had gone white gripping the edge of the counter. The temperature in the bookstore seemed to drop 10 degrees. Is there a problem here? Thorne's rough voice carried an undertone of deadly promise. Seraphine's perfect smile never wavered. No problem at all. I was just introducing myself to your mate. We're old acquaintances from Shadowmere. I wanted to wish her well on her new bonding. Thoughtful. The word came out flat, devoid of anything resembling belief. But I think you've said enough. He moved to stand beside Ivory, not quite touching, but close enough that his presence felt like a physical shield. The message was clear to anyone with eyes to see it. This Omega is under my protection. Challenge her at your own risk. Seraphine's amber eyes flashed with something that might have been anger or might have been satisfaction. Hard to tell with someone so practiced at hiding true emotion beneath social masks. How fortunate Ivory is, she said with honeyed sweetness, to have found alphas willing to defend her from simple conversation. I'm sure she needs all the protection she can get. She moved toward the door with unhurried grace, paused with one hand on the handle to deliver her parting shot. Do give Valen my regards when you see him next. I'm sure he'll be very interested to hear how his former ward is adjusting to her new life. These things have a way of circling back, don't they? Consequences of choices made in haste. The bell chimed. She was gone. The bookstore felt oppressively quiet in her wake. Ivory realized she was shaking. Not from fear exactly, from the kind of rage that came from being dismissed and insulted and reminded that no matter how far she ran, her past would always follow. Would always find ways to reduce her to that pitied albino Omega who didn't know her place. Hey, Thorne's voice was surprisingly gentle. Look at me. She forced herself to meet his gaze. She's wrong about everything, he said with absolute certainty. You're not fragile. You're not a burden. You're not someone we settled for or are patiently tolerating. You're our mate, our equal, and anyone who suggests otherwise can answer to me. The conviction in his voice transmitted through the bond, along with fierce protectiveness and genuine fury on her behalf. He meant every word. Would fight anyone who dared suggest she was less than worthy. The realization made Ivory's throat tight. She's going to tell Valen, she said quietly. She'll go straight back to Shadowmere and tell him I'm bonded and where I'm working and he'll... She trailed off because she didn't actually know what Valen would do with that information. 6 months ago, he'd offered an arranged mating to protect her. She'd rejected him publicly, destroyed his credibility as an alpha in front of 200 witnesses. And now she'd bonded with 3 different alphas without pack permission or approval. That was grounds for challenge, for formal contest through the Shifter Council, for consequences she couldn't predict. Then let him come, Thorne said with cold finality. Let him challenge the bond if he's stupid enough to try on. We'll bury him in documentation and precedent, and the simple fact that breakthrough heats don't ask permission before forming sacred bonds. You're not going back there, Ivory. Not unless you choose to, and anyone who tries to force you will go through all 3 of us first. The promise settled something anxious inside her. She wasn't facing this alone. Whatever came next, she had 3 alphas who would stand between her and anything that threatened her safety or autonomy. That night, alone in her apartment with rain pattering against the windows, Ivory stared at her phone for 20 minutes before finally opening her messages. She had 3 missed calls from a number she didn't recognize. 2 voicemails. Her finger hovered over the play button. Part of her knew who it would be before she pressed it. Some instinct that recognized danger even through digital distance. Valen's voice filled her small bedroom. Deep. Controlled. Carrying the weight of alpha authority even through a recording. Ivory, I heard about your bonding to the Nightshade triplets. We need to talk. This situation is complicated. Call me back at this number. We'll discuss this privately before it becomes a pack matter. The message ended. The second one was shorter, colder. You can't avoid this conversation forever. I'm filing a formal challenge with the Shifter Council by the end of the week. Your bonding happened without pack approval during a compromised state. The council will want testimony from all parties involved. Prepare yourself, Ivory. This is about to become very public. Her phone slipped from nerveless fingers. Challenge, Vaishal, council hearing. Public testimony about the most intimate, vulnerable moment of her life. Everything she'd built in 3 months of independence was about to be dragged into pack politics and legal proceedings. Everything she'd fought for was suddenly at risk. The bond flared in her chest. 3 distinct emotions surging through the connection. Thorn's immediate rage, Zephyr's cold calculation, Caius's protective concern. Her bedroom door flew open less than 30 seconds later. All 3 of them crowded into her small space like living shields, golden eyes blazing with barely restrained violence. We felt your panic, Caius said quietly. What happened? Ivory handed him the phone with trembling hands. Let them listen to Valen's messages while she tried to remember how to breathe through the crushing weight pressing against her ribs. When the recordings ended, silence filled the room like poison. Zephyr spoke first, his voice terrifyingly calm. He's challenging the bond through the council, claiming heat coercion and unsanctioned cross-pack mating. It's a standard legal maneuver when an alpha loses a potential mate to rivals. He's trying to invalidate our connection and force you back under Shadowmere authority. Can he do that? Ivory's voice came out small, frightened. Everything she'd promised herself she wouldn't be. He can try. Thorn's rough voice carried an edge of barely leashed fury. But he's going to fail. We have medical documentation. Witness testimony. Proof that your heat was life-threatening and our intervention was necessary. The council won't invalidate a sacred bond just because some alpha's ego got bruised. You don't know that. The words burst out before she could stop them. You don't know what Valen's capable of. He's been alpha of Shadowmere for 15 years. He has connections, political leverage, and I humiliated him in front of his entire pack. He's not going to let that go. Then we'll fight him. Zephyr's intense gaze locked onto hers with absolute certainty. In court and council chambers, wherever he wants to take this. But Ivory, you need to understand something. You're not alone in this. You're bonded to Moonshadow Pack now through us. That's our alpha's territory, our protection, our resources. Valen doesn't get to dictate terms anymore. Moonshadow Pack. She'd been so focused on the triplets themselves that she hadn't considered the larger implications. Bonding with them meant joining their pack, accepting protection from a completely different alpha, entering a political structure she knew nothing about. I need to meet your alpha, she said quietly. If this is going to become a pack matter, I should know who's representing me. The 3 brothers exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them through whatever mysterious connection triplets shared beyond normal pack bonds. Caius nodded slowly. Alpha Astrid wishes you want to meet you regardless. Tomorrow. We'll arrange it. Alpha Astrid of Moonshadow Pack was nothing like Valen Blackthorn. Where Valen commanded through dominance and authority that demanded submission, Astrid led with quiet strength that invited trust. She was 45 years old with silver-streaked black hair and eyes the color of smoke. Scars marked her face and hands, the kind earned through battles fought and survived rather than displays of dominance. She received Ivory in her private office rather than a formal pack gathering. The room was warm, comfortable, filled with books and plants and photographs of pack members in candid moments of joy. It felt lived in, real. Nothing like the cold formality of Shadowmere's leadership chambers. Ivory Winters, Astrid's voice carried gentle authority. The Nightshade triplets have told me about your bonding, about Shadowmere's challenge, about Valen Blackthorn and his complicated relationship with your family. She gestured to a comfortable chair across from her desk. Sit, please. We have much to discuss. Ivory sat with her hands folded in her lap, posture perfect from years of learning to make herself small and unthreatening. Astrid studied her for a long moment. You don't have to do that here, she said quietly. Make yourself smaller. Moonshadow isn't Shadowmere. We don't judge worth by bloodline or appearance. We judge by character and contribution. And from what I've seen, you have both in abundance. The casual acceptance made Ivory's throat tight. Thank you, she managed. The triplets ought to you is legitimate under pack law and moon law. Astrid continued. Breakthrough heats are recognized as sacred calling. The moon goddess herself orchestrated your connection. No council can invalidate that without committing blasphemy. She leaned forward, elbows resting on her desk. But Valen isn't challenging the bond itself. He's challenging the circumstances, claiming you were coerced during a vulnerable state, that the triplets took advantage of a medical emergency to force a connection you wouldn't have chosen otherwise. Ivory's hands clenched in her lap. That's not what happened. I know that. You know that. The triplets know that. But we'll need to prove it to a council that doesn't know any of you personally. We'll need medical records, testimony, evidence that this bond formed naturally rather than through manipulation. Astrid pulled a tablet from her desk drawer, stylus already moving across the screen with practiced efficiency. I'm assigning a legal team to your case. They'll start gathering documentation immediately, medical records from the emergency, witness statements from the dispatcher who took your call, proof of your suppressant prescriptions, and the fact that breakthrough heats override medication. We'll build a defense that leaves no room for doubt. She paused, smoke-colored eyes meeting Ivory's with surprising gentleness. But I need you to understand something. This process is going to be invasive. The council will want details about the most intimate moments of your life. You'll have to testify about your heat, about the bonding, about choices made when you were barely conscious and drowning in biological imperatives. It won't be easy. Ivory swallowed hard against the anxiety rising in her throat. What if I can't do it? What if I freeze up or say the wrong thing or make it worse? Then we'll prepare you until you can. Astrid's voice carried absolute certainty. The triplets will be beside you every step. I'll be beside you. Moonshadow Pack will be beside you. You're not facing this alone, Ivory. That's what Pack means. The words settled something fundamental inside her. This was what she'd been searching for when she left Shadowmere. Not just independence, but belonging. A place where she was valued rather than tolerated, protected rather than controlled, seen as a person with worth rather than a problem to be managed. I'll do whatever it takes, Ivory said quietly. I won't let Valen invalidate this bond. I won't let him take away the first real choice I've made for myself. Astrid smiled. Good, because we're going to win this, Ivory, not just legally. We're going to expose exactly what kind of alpha Valen Blackthorn is beneath all that protective rhetoric. And when we're done, Shadowmere will never threaten you again. The promise carried weight, the kind of certainty that came from an alpha who'd fought battles and won them through strategy rather than brute force. 2 weeks later, the formal challenge arrived via courier. Heavy parchment with official council seals. Legal language that boiled down to accusations Ivory had been dreading. Coercion during heat. Unsanctioned cross-pack bonding. Violation of arranged mating agreements. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out. Neutral territory. 7 council elders presiding. Both packs would present evidence and testimony. A decision would be rendered within 24 hours of closing arguments. Ivory's fate would be determined by strangers who knew nothing about her except what lawyers chose to present. The preparation period passed in a blur of legal meetings and documentation review. Astrid's team was thorough to the point of intimidation. They dug up every piece of evidence related to Ivory's time in Shadowmere. Childhood medical records showing the discrimination she'd faced. School reports documenting bullying that had been ignored by pack leadership. Employment records proving she'd worked twice as hard for half the opportunities. They found witnesses willing to testify. Former pack members who'd left Shadowmere and had no loyalty to Valen's authority. Humans who'd worked with Ivory and could speak to her character. Medical professionals who could explain breakthrough heat biology. They built a case that was ironclad, but none of it addressed the emotional reality underneath the legal maneuvering. 3 weeks before the hearing, Ivory sat in her apartment, surrounded by legal briefs and testimony prep notes, and felt the walls closing in. She'd fought so hard for independence, had built a life on her own terms through sheer stubborn determination, and now she was trapped in exactly the kind of pack politics she'd been trying to escape. Her autonomy debated by strangers, her choices questioned by a council that saw her as an Omega who needed protecting from her own decisions. The knock on her door was gentle, familiar. She opened it to find Isla standing in the hallway. Her sister, 22 years old with their mother's dark hair and none of the genetic quirk that had marked Ivory as different. She wore designer jeans and a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than Ivory's rent, carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd never had to question whether she belonged. They stared at each other across the threshold. "Can I come in?" Ayla asked quietly. Ivory stepped back without answering. Let her sister enter the small apartment that represented everything Ivory had built alone. Every sacrifice made, every night working double shifts, every moment of proving she could survive without pack support. Isla's gaze swept the space with something that might have been respect or might have been pity. Hard to tell with someone who'd spent years mastering social masks. "I heard about the council challenge," she said, "about Valen formally contesting your bond. I wanted to, I don't know, warn you, I guess, or apologize. Both maybe. Warn me about what—" Isla sank onto the second-hand couch without waiting for invitation. "Valen isn't just challenging the bond because you rejected him. He's doing it because he promised Father he'd protect you. And in Valen's mind, protecting you means controlling every aspect of your life until you accept that you need him." She met Ivory's eyes with surprising directness. "He loved Dad like a brother. When Father died and left you in his care, Valen took that responsibility seriously. Too seriously. The arranged mating wasn't just about protection or status. It was about fulfilling a promise to a dead man. And you rejecting him publicly, that was like rejecting Father's final wish." The words hit harder than Ivory expected. She'd known about her father's friendship with Valen, had understood on some level that the arranged mating proposal came from obligation rather than attraction. But hearing it spelled out so clearly made everything more complicated. Valen wasn't a simple villain. He was an alpha who'd made a promise and was trying to keep it through methods that completely ignored Ivory's autonomy. "That doesn't make what he's doing okay," Ivory said quietly. "Good intentions don't excuse control disguised as protection." "I know." Isla's voice was surprisingly small. "I know that now. But for a long time I didn't. I thought you were being ungrateful. Foolish. Throwing away security because you wanted to prove some point about independence. And when Valen offered to make me beta if I helped him locate you—" She trailed off. The confession hung in the air between them. Betrayal. Her own sister had betrayed her location to Valen for the promise of status and power. Ivory's hands clenched into fists. "You told him where I work, where I live. You fed him information so he could track me down and force me back under his authority." "Yes." Isla didn't look away, didn't make excuses, just held Ivory's gaze with something that might have been shame. "I did, because I was jealous and bitter and tired of being the normal sister of the special albino. 3 alphas wanted you, the defective one, the embarrassment, and I couldn't stand it. The honesty was almost worse than the betrayal." "So what now?" Ivory asked, her voice harder than she had ever used with her sister. "Did you come here to confess, to ask forgiveness, to warn me that Valen has more ammunition for the hearing?" "I came to tell you that I'm testifying on your behalf." The words stopped Ivory cold. What Isla stood with sudden intensity. "I'm testifying at the council hearing, against Valen, against Shadowmere. I'll tell them everything. Every time the pack discriminated against you because of your albinism. Every instance where Valen's protection was actually control. Every moment where you proved you were stronger than any of us gave you credit for." Tears streaked down her face now, real emotion breaking through years of practiced composure. "I was wrong, Ivory. Wrong about you. Wrong about what strength looks like. Wrong about following someone who promised me power in exchange for betraying my own sister. And I can't undo what I've done, but I can stand up in front of that council and tell them the truth." Ivory stared at her sister, saw genuine remorse in eyes that had always held distance and judgment. "Why?" The question came out smaller than she intended. "Why change now?" "Because watching you fight for yourself made me realize I've never fought for anything real in my life. I've just followed whoever offered the easiest path. And that's not strength. That's cowardice." Isla moved toward the door, paused with one hand on the handle. "You don't have to forgive me. Don't have to trust me ever again. But I'm going to do the right thing this time, even if it costs me everything." She left. The door clicked, shut behind her. Ivory stood alone in her apartment with legal briefs scattered across every surface and her sister's confession echoing in her ears. The world was more complicated than she'd wanted to believe. Valen wasn't a simple villain, but a man trying to honor a promise through fundamentally wrong methods. Isla wasn't just a jealous sister, but someone capable of growth and genuine remorse. And Ivory herself wasn't the helpless victim she'd spent years believing she was. She was someone worth fighting for, someone worth three alphas bonding their lives to, someone worth an entire pack standing beside. The hearing was in 3 weeks, and Ivory Winters was going to face it with her head held high. The council chambers sat on neutral territory between pack lands, a massive stone building that predated modern shifter politics by centuries. 7 elders occupied the raised platform at the front of the hall, their faces carved from years of judging disputes and rendering verdicts that altered lives with the stroke of a pen. Ivory sat between Thorn and Chaos with Zephyr directly behind her chair, like a living shield. Alpha Astrid occupied the seat to her left, smoke-colored eyes scanning the assembled witnesses and legal teams with tactical precision. Across the aisle, Velen Blackthorn sat in perfect stillness. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Ivory's entire wardrobe. Dark hair threaded with silver at his temples caught the light from overhead fixtures. Whiskey-colored eyes remained fixed on some point in the middle distance, refusing to meet her gaze directly. He looked tired, older than she remembered from 6 months ago when she'd rejected his proposal in front of 200 witnesses. The weight of alpha authority seemed to sit heavier on his shoulders now. Like maintaining absolute control over Shadowmere Pack was draining something essential from him year by year. The head elder, a woman in her 70s with iron gray hair and eyes sharp as broken glass, called the hearing to order. We are gathered to address the formal challenge filed by Alpha Velen Blackthorn of Shadowmere Pack regarding the mate bond between Ivory Winters and the Nightshade triplets of Moonshadow Pack. The charges are threefold: heat coercion, unsanctioned cross-pack bonding, violation of arranged mating agreements. Her voice carried across the silent chamber with the kind of authority that made even the strongest wolves sit straighter in their seats. Both parties will present evidence and testimony. The council will deliberate and render verdict within 24 hours. Alpha Blackthorn, you may begin. Valen's lawyer stood, a sharp-featured woman in expensive heels who moved to the center of the floor with practiced confidence. For the next hour, she built a case that made Ivory's bonding sound like manipulation rather than destiny. Medical expert testimony about heat vulnerability and compromised decision-making capacity. Traditional pack law regarding arranged matings and the weight of promises made to dying pack members. Character witnesses from Shadowmere who spoke about Valen's years of leadership and his genuine concern for Ivory's well-being. It was professionally executed. Convincing if you didn't know the full context. Made Ivory sound like a naive Omega who'd been taken advantage of during the most vulnerable moment of her existence by 3 alphas who saw an opportunity and seized it. When the lawyer finished, silence filled the chamber like poison. Ivory could feel anxiety crawling up her spine, could sense through the bonds that Thorn wanted to tear something apart with his bare hands. That Zephyr was calculating 12 different counter-arguments simultaneously. That Chaos was fighting the urge to pull her into his arms and shield her from the weight of judgment pressing down from 7 council elders. Then Astrid's legal team stood. The lead attorney was a man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and eyes that missed nothing. He moved to the center of the floor with unhurried grace tablet in hand containing every piece of evidence they'd spent 3 weeks gathering. Council elders, the defense would like to present medical documentation regarding breakthrough heats and their biological imperative. For the next 2 hours, he systematically dismantled every argument Valen's team had made. Medical records proving Ivory's suppressants had been properly prescribed and taken as directed. Dispatch recordings of her emergency call voice barely coherent with fever and pain. Testimony from the triplets' supervisor confirming they'd been on a different call 5 blocks away when all 3 simultaneously felt the mate pull. Expert witnesses explained breakthrough heat biology, how an Omega's body recognized its true mate and overrode every suppressant in conscious choice to force proximity, how without alpha intervention, Ivory would have died within hours, how the mate bond that formed wasn't coercion, but sacred calling orchestrated by the moon goddess herself. Then came the documentation about Shadowmere. School records showing bullying reports that had been ignored by pack leadership. Medical files documenting discrimination Ivory had faced because of her albinism. Employment records proving she'd been passed over for advancement despite superior qualifications. Witness after witness testified about the toxic environment that had driven Ivory to leave her birth pack and seek independence in a neutral city. When Isla Winters took the stand, the chamber went absolutely silent. Ivory's sister looked smaller than usual despite designer clothes and perfect makeup. She gripped the witness rail with white-knuckled intensity, amber eyes fixed on the council elders rather than anyone in the gallery. State your name and relationship to the Omega in question, the defense attorney prompted gently. Isla Winters, I'm Ivory's older sister. And you were a member of Shadowmere Pack when Ivory lived there. Yes. Can you describe the treatment Ivory received from Pack members? Isla's voice shook slightly but held steady. She was called defective from the time we were children. Pack members would avoid sitting near her at gatherings, whisper about how her albinism was a sign the moon goddess had rejected her. I heard adults say she shouldn't be allowed to breed because her condition might be genetic. She paused, swallowed hard. I participated in that. I was ashamed of having a sister who looked different, who made our family a target for gossip and judgment. When Alpha Blackthorn proposed the arranged mating, I thought it was her only chance at any kind of status or protection. When she rejected him, I was furious because she'd embarrassed him publicly and by extension, embarrassed me. What did you do with that anger? The attorney asked quietly. I told Alpha Blackthorn where Ivory was working in Thornhaven, what her schedule was, where she lived. He offered to make me beta if I helped him track her down and convince her to return to Shadowmere. I agreed. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Valen's expression remained carefully neutral, but something flickered in those whiskey-colored eyes. Surprise, maybe, or betrayal that his actions were being exposed so publicly. Why are you testifying today? The attorney continued. Isla finally looked at Ivory directly. Because my sister spent 19 years being told she was less than everyone else because of how she looks. And then she found 3 alphas who see her as exactly what they've been searching for their entire lives, who bonded with her not despite her differences, but because those differences mark her as blessed rather than cursed. And I'm not going to let anyone, including me, take that away from her. Tears streaked down her face now. Ivory is the strongest person I know. She survived Shadowmere, survived breakthrough heat alone, built a life on her own terms through sheer determination. And if this council invalidates her bond, you're saying that Omegas don't have the right to choose their own mates. That vulnerability negates consent. That traditional pack politics matter more than sacred calling. I won't be part of that. The attorney let the words hang in the air for a long moment before speaking. No further questions. When Ivory herself took the stand, every eye in the chamber fixed on her with laser focus. The head elder leaned forward slightly. Miss Winters, in your own words, please describe the events leading to your bonding with the Nightshade triplets. Ivory's hands trembled in her lap. She forced them still through sheer will, refused to show weakness in front of strangers who held her future in their hands. I presented as Omega at 18, she began, voice steadier than she felt. My first heat was manageable with suppressants. I left Shadowmere Pack 6 months ago to build an independent life in Thornhaven. I worked 2 jobs, paid my own rent, took my suppressants exactly as prescribed. I was careful. I was responsible. I did everything right. She paused, remembering that afternoon when everything changed. 3 days after my 19th birthday, I was working at the bookstore when the heat struck. It was different from anything I'd experienced before, like burning alive from the inside out. The suppressants did nothing. I could barely think through the pain and fever. I knew I was dying. Her gaze swept across the council elders, demanding they see her as a person rather than a legal case. I called for help because I wanted to live. The Nightshade triplets responded to a medical emergency. They didn't take advantage of my vulnerability. They gave me a choice even when I was barely conscious. They explained the risks and consequences. They asked for consent multiple times. And yes, I was in heat. Yes, I was desperate, but I chose them. She stood now, unable to remain seated under the weight of what needed to be said. Alpha Blackthorn claims he was trying to protect me with his arranged mating proposal. But protection isn't control. Protection doesn't ignore what the person being protected actually wants. He promised my father he'd keep me safe, and I understand that promise weighs on him. But my father is dead, and I'm alive, and I have the right to choose my own future even if that choice doesn't align with what others think is best for me. The chamber was absolutely silent. The Nightshade triplets didn't see me as broken or defective or someone who needed fixing. They saw me as their mate, their equal, someone worth bonding their entire lives to. That's not coercion. That's the moon goddess, knowing exactly what she was doing when she created the 4 of us for each other. She met Valen's gaze directly for the first time. I'm grateful for what you tried to do for my father, but I'm not his legacy to manage. I'm my own person, and this bond is my choice. The head elder's expression remained unreadable. You may step down. The final arguments took another hour, both sides summarizing evidence and testimony, making last appeals to council authority and tradition and law. When everything that could be said had been spoken, the elders retired to deliberate. Ivory sat in the gallery with her three alphas surrounding her, like living shields, felt their emotions through the bonds, steady, certain, ready to fight if the verdict went the wrong way. Alpha Astrid's smoke-colored eyes met hers with quiet confidence. "They'll rule in your favor," she said softly. "The evidence is too strong, the bond too sacred. Even the most traditional elders can't invalidate moon-blessed calling without committing blasphemy." But Ivory had learned long ago that what should happen and what actually happened were often very different things. 3 hours later, the council returned. The head elder's expression remained carved from stone as she surveyed the assembled witnesses and legal teams. "The council has reached a verdict." Every wolf in the chamber held their breath. "After reviewing all evidence and testimony, we find that the mate bond between Ivory Winters and the Nightshade triplets formed under legitimate circumstances. Breakthrough heats are recognized as sacred calling. The biological imperative to bond with true mates supersedes pack politics and prior arrangements. Miss Winters demonstrated clear capacity for consent despite medical distress. The Nightshade triplets acted according to emergency medical protocols while respecting Omega autonomy." She paused, gaze shifting to Valen directly. "Furthermore, this council finds that Alpha Blackthorn's challenge was filed in good faith based on genuine concern for Miss Winters' well-being. However, his methods of protection crossed into control. The arranged mating proposal, while well-intentioned, failed to account for the Omega's clearly stated preferences. The subsequent tracking and pressure to return to Shadowmere Pack constituted harassment." Valen's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. "Therefore, the council's ruling is as follows. The mate bond between Ivory Winters and the Nightshade triplets is valid and legally recognized. All challenges are dismissed. Alpha Blackthorn is formally censured for overreach of authority. Shadowmere Pack is ordered to cease all contact with Ivory Winters unless she initiates communication. Any violation of this order will result in sanctions, including potential removal of Pack status." The gavel came down with the sound of finality. "This hearing is concluded." The gallery erupted, voices overlapping in shock and speculation, and the kind of gossip that would spread through Pack networks for months. Ivory sat frozen in her seat, barely processing the words that had just altered the course of her existence. She'd won. The bond was legitimate. Valen couldn't touch her anymore. She was free. The realization hit like a physical force, made her knees weak and her eyes burn with tears she refused to let fall in front of 200 witnesses. Thorn's arms came around her from behind, solid and warm and absolutely certain. "It's over." His rough voice rumbled against her ear. "You're ours, legally, permanently. No one can challenge that now." Zephyr and Chaos closed in from either side, creating a wall of protective alpha that shut out the chaos of the gallery. She'd won. But looking across the aisle at Valen's carefully controlled expression, Ivory realized victory tasted more complicated than she'd expected. 8 months after the bonding that changed everything, Ivory Winter's Nightshade stood in the Moonshadow Pack library, organizing historical records, and realized she was happy. Genuinely, fundamentally happy in ways she'd never experienced before. The library had become her sanctuary. Rows of leather-bound books chronicling Pack histories and werewolf lore. Comfortable reading chairs positioned near windows that overlooked Pack territory. A space that was hers to manage and organize according to systems that made sense to her methodical mind. Alpha Astrid had given her the position with no strings attached. Just recognition of competence and genuine interest in preserving Pack knowledge. The work filled something inside Ivory she hadn't known was empty. She mentored young wolves who felt different or struggled to fit in. Taught them that the qualities that made them unusual were often the same qualities that made them extraordinary. Watched them blossom under acceptance and validation in ways she wished someone had done for her at that age. The triplets had kept their promise about giving her space while maintaining connection. They'd found a house together on the edge of Pack lands, large enough for 4 people with room for privacy when needed. A library that had made Ivory's eyes light up with pure joy. A massive kitchen where Chaos could indulge his love of cooking. Enough land that they could run in wolf form without encountering neighbors. Mornings belonged to Thorn. He'd wake her with coffee prepared exactly right and gentle touches that grounded her before the day began. They'd sit together in comfortable silence while dawn light filtered through bedroom windows. He'd learned that she didn't need words first thing in the morning. Just presence. Just the steady certainty of someone who would always be there. Afternoons belonged to Zephyr. He'd appear at the library during her lunch break with food he'd prepared himself and updates about Pack politics she should know. They discussed strategy and planning and the future they were building together. His sharp intelligence balanced her emotional intuition in ways that made every decision stronger. Evenings belonged to Caius. He'd find her when the library closed and guide her home with gentle touches. They'd curl up together with books or terrible reality television. He understood when she needed quiet company after spending the day with people, gave her space to simply exist without performing or proving anything. Nights belonged to all three of them. And Ivory had learned that intimacy with triplet alphas meant never feeling alone, meant being surrounded by love so complete it sometimes overwhelmed her, meant trusting that someone would always catch her when she fell. She'd healed in ways she hadn't known she was broken. The library door opened, pulling Ivory from her thoughts. A young girl entered with the kind of careful movements that spoke to years of learning to make herself small. Maybe 12 years old, painfully thin, dark hair hanging in her face, eyes that kept scanning for threats even in the safety of the library. Ivory recognized that posture, had worn it herself for 19 years. "Can I help you find something?" she asked gently, keeping her voice soft and non-threatening. The girl flinched at being directly addressed. "My mom said the library has books about wolves who are different. Special wolves. I wanted—" She trailed off clearly, expecting judgment or dismissal. Ivory moved closer with deliberate care, crouching down to eye level so she wasn't looming over the child. "What's your name?" "Mira." "Hi, Mira. I'm Ivory. And yes, we have lots of books about special wolves. Different wolves. Wolves who didn't fit the normal patterns, but turned out to be exactly what the moon goddess intended. Would you like to see them?" Mira's eyes widened slightly, the first spark of hope breaking through defensive walls. Really, really. Ivory spent the next hour showing Mira books about historical wolves who'd been outcasts and became leaders. Albino wolves blessed by the moon goddess. Omegas who were stronger than alphas in ways that mattered. Every story chosen specifically to reflect back that being different wasn't being less. Mira absorbed every word with desperate intensity. When her mother came to collect her at closing time, the woman's expression was wary. "Thank you for helping her," she said quietly. "Mira's been struggling since we joined Moonshadow. Her last pack wasn't kind to wolves who didn't fit their standards." Ivory understood that language, the careful words hiding abuse and discrimination. "She's welcome here any time," Ivory said firmly. "The library is a safe space, and if she ever needs to talk, I'm here." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you. You have no idea what that means." But Ivory did know. Exactly. Intimately. Because she'd been Mira once. A child who needed just one person to see her value when everyone else saw only defects. Over the next 2 weeks, Mira became a regular fixture in the library. She'd arrive after school and curl up in one of the reading chairs with whatever book Ivory recommended. Sometimes they'd talk. More often, they'd exist in comfortable silence. Two wolves who understood what it meant to be different, building trust through presence rather than words. Ivory learned that Mira's father had been abusive, that her mother had finally escaped with her daughter and sought refuge in Moonshadow, that the girl had learned to make herself invisible as a survival mechanism. "You remind me of someone," Ivory said one afternoon while shelving returns. Mira looked up from her book. "Huta." "Me, when I was your age." The girl's eyes widened. "But you're the Luna's mate. You're bonded to 3 alphas. Everyone respects you." "That's true now. But it wasn't always true. When I was your age, I was the weird albino girl that other kids avoided. I believed I was defective because that's what everyone told me. It took me 19 years to learn that different isn't wrong, it's just different." Mira was silent for a long moment. "Does it get better?" The question carried such desperate hope that Ivory's heart ached. It gets better when you find your people. When you stop trying to fit into spaces that were never meant for you and start building your own space. When you recognize that the qualities that make you different are often the same qualities that make you extraordinary. How do you find your people? Sometimes they find you. The library door crashed open with enough force to slam against the wall. A man stood in the doorway, 30-something, muscular in the way that spoke to violence rather than fitness, eyes that tracked Mira with predatory focus. "There you are." His voice carried casual menace. "Your mother's been looking everywhere. Time to go home." Mira went absolutely still, the kind of frozen terror that animals display when facing predators. Ivory moved between them without conscious thought. "The library doesn't close for another hour," she said calmly, despite adrenaline flooding her system. "Mira is welcome to stay until then." The man's gaze shifted to Ivory, assessing and dismissing in the same moment. "This doesn't concern you, Albino. This is pack business." Mira is under my protection while she's in this library. If her mother needs her, she can come collect her daughter herself. You need to leave." He laughed, low and ugly. "Or what you'll call your alpha mates hide behind their protection, like the weak little Omega you are." He moved toward Mira. Ivory's vision went red. Something primal and fierce and absolutely uncompromising rose up from the core of her being. Every protective instinct she'd developed through years of being defenseless and alone and desperate for someone to defend her finally found its target. This man would not touch this child, would not hurt someone smaller and weaker, would not get past Ivory while she still drew breath. The transformation hit without warning. One moment she was standing on two legs with human hands clenched into fists. The next her body was reshaping itself, bones cracking and reforming, muscles expanding, senses exploding into hyperfocus. She'd never shifted before. 19 years of being told it was impossible for someone with her condition, that her wolf was as defective as the rest of her, that she'd spend her entire life trapped in human form while other shifters claimed their birthright. But the wolf that emerged was anything but defective. Pure white fur caught afternoon light streaming through library windows. Ice blue eyes fixed on the threat with absolute focus. Size that matched any alpha despite Omega designation. Ancient strength that had been waiting for exactly the right moment to emerge. Ivory's wolf snarled with a sound that made the man stumble backward, made him recognize predator when he'd assumed he was facing prey. She didn't attack, didn't need to, just stood between him and Mira with every line of her body communicating crystal clear message. Leave, now, or face consequences you won't survive. The man fled, literally turned and ran from the library like hell itself was on his heels. Ivory's wolf turned to check on Mira. The girl stared up at her with wide eyes. No fear, just wonder and awe and something that looked like hope. "You shifted," she whispered. "You're beautiful." The words unlocked something inside Ivory. She was beautiful, not despite the white fur and unusual size. Because of it. This was what the moon goddess had intended all along. A wolf that stood out rather than blending in. A protector rather than someone who needed protecting. Strength that had been waiting for the right catalyst to emerge. The library door opened again. This time it was her three alphas moving with coordinated precision, born from years of working together. Thorn in the lead, Zephyr and Chaos flanking. All of them shifted into massive gray wolves that filled the space with predatory presence. They'd felt her surge of protective fury through the bonds, had responded instantly despite being scattered across packed territory. Thorn's wolf moved to her side, golden eyes cataloging her shifted form with something between shock and fierce pride. He nuzzled against her neck, scent, marking and claiming and celebrating all at once. Zephyr and Caius circled, examining her white wolf from every angle with obvious satisfaction. Their mate was complete now, every part of her finally in harmony. Within minutes, the entire pack seemed to converge on the library. Wolves shifted and unshifted, voices overlapping in excitement and speculation. Alpha Astrid pushed through the crowd with authority that made everyone step aside automatically. She studied Ivory's white wolf with smoke-colored eyes that missed nothing. "The prophecy was true," she said quietly. "White wolves appear when the pack needs protection, when balance needs to shift. You were always meant for this, Ivory, always meant to be exactly what you are." Ivory shifted back to human form, stood there in torn clothes with white hair wild around her shoulders and certainty burning in her chest. The library around her was chaos. Pack members crowding to see the legendary white wolf. Mira's mother had arrived and was holding her daughter with tears streaming down her face. The abusive man was being escorted off Packlands by security, and Ivory felt complete for the first time in her life. Not because she'd shifted, but because she'd finally accepted what she'd spent 19 years denying. She wasn't defective, she was blessed. 1 year after the bonding that changed everything, Moonshadow Pack gathered in the main hall for a celebration that felt like homecoming. Torches lined stone walls, their flickering light dancing across faces that looked at Ivory with genuine warmth rather than judgment. The scent of pine and autumn and celebration filled the air. Alpha Astrid stood at the raised platform with smoke-colored eyes reflecting firelight. Ivory walked to the front of the hall flanked by her three alphas. She wore a simple white dress that made her albinism look deliberate rather than defective. White hair cascaded down her back in waves. Confidence carried her forward with head held high. This was nothing like the Shadowmere gathering where she'd stood small and afraid while 200 wolves judged her worth. This was celebration, recognition, family claiming one of their own. 1 year ago, Alpha Astrid began her voice carrying to every corner of the hall. 3 of our finest alphas found their true mate during a medical emergency. Today, we formally recognize Ivory Winter's Nightshade as a full member of Moonshadow Pack, as the bonded mate of Thorn Zephyr and Chaos Nightshade, as our guardian Omega who teaches our young ones that different isn't defective, as the white wolf who emerged when we needed her most. The pack erupted in howls and cheers, genuine celebration that wrapped around Ivory like warmth. You've become invaluable to this pack, Astrid continued, speaking directly to Ivory now. Not as the triplets' mate, though that's part of who you are, but as Ivory, the woman who survived what would have killed most Omegas, who built a new life from nothing, who gives so generously to help others who struggle to fit in. You are Pack Ivory, truly and completely. The words settled something fundamental inside her. After the ceremony, Pack members surrounded her with congratulations and well wishes. Children she'd mentored in the library brought handmade cards. Adults she'd helped integrate into Pack life thanked her for making space for their differences. Mira approached with her mother carrying a small wrapped package. "This is for you," the girl said shyly, "for teaching me that being different is okay." Inside was a hand-carved wooden bookmark with white wolf etched into the surface. Ivory pulled Mira into a hug, not caring that tears were streaming down her face in front of 200 witnesses. "Thank you," she whispered, "for letting me protect you, for reminding me why strength matters." Later that evening, as the celebration continued around them, a messenger approached with formal parchment, a request from Valen Blackthorn, not a demand, not a challenge, a request to meet privately, to speak without lawyers or politics or Pack authority complicating what needed to be said. Ivory looked at her 3 alphas. "It's your choice," Thorn said firmly. "We'll support whatever you decide. If you want to meet him, we'll be there. If you want to refuse, we'll handle the response. You don't owe him anything." "But maybe I owe myself closure," she said quietly. 2 weeks later, Ivory sat across from Valen Blackthorn in a neutral coffee shop halfway between Shadowmere and Moonshadow territories. Her 3 alphas occupied a table near the window, close enough to intervene if needed, but far enough to give privacy for difficult conversation. Valen looked older than she remembered, more tired, like the weight of leadership had carved new lines around his eyes and mouth. They sat in silence for a long moment, neither quite knowing where to begin untangling months of conflict and hurt and misunderstanding. Finally, Valen spoke. "I owe you an apology." The words hung between them, simple, direct, carrying more weight than elaborate explanation. "I made a promise to your father before he died, told him I'd watch over you, keep you safe, make sure the Pack treated you fairly despite your differences. And I took that promise seriously, too seriously." He met her gaze directly. "But protection isn't control, and safety isn't forcing someone into a life they don't want. I convinced myself that the arranged mating was the only way to give you status and security, that you were too naive to understand the dangers you'd face unmated, that I knew better than you what you needed." Valen's hands clenched around his coffee cup. "I was wrong about everything. You didn't need me to fix you or protect you or make decisions on your behalf. You needed me to trust that your father raised a daughter strong enough to make her own choices. And I failed that. Failed him. Failed you." Ivory felt tears prickling at her eyes despite her determination to remain composed. "The arranged mating proposal humiliated you publicly," she said quietly. "Rejecting you destroyed your credibility as Alpha. I understand why you challenged the bond, why you wanted to prove I'd made a mistake. That's not why I challenged it." The confession stopped her cold. "I challenged the bond because I was terrified," Valen admitted, and his voice cracked slightly on the word. "Terrified that you'd bonded with 3 strangers during a medical emergency, that you'd die from complications or be trapped in a bad situation, that my promise to protect you meant I had to save you from yourself." He laughed bitterly. "But you didn't need saving. You found exactly what you were meant to find. And the council hearing proved that. Watching you testify, seeing the evidence of how poorly Shadowmere treated you, hearing your sister confess to betrayal, it shattered every justification I'd built for my actions." "What happened after the hearing?" Ivory asked, genuinely curious. "The council censured you. How did Shadowmere react?" "Like I deserved it." Valen's smile was self-deprecating. "Turns out overreaching Alpha authority doesn't inspire confidence in Pack leadership. I've spent the last year implementing changes, anti-discrimination policies, Protections for Omegas who want to live independently. Accountability measures so leadership can't abuse power. Everything I should have done years ago. He pulled a folder from his bag, sliding it across the table. This is formal documentation that Shadowmere Pack apologizes for the treatment you received. We're offering reparations, financial compensation for lost opportunities, a public apology to be issued to all neighboring packs, recognition that you were failed by leadership who should have protected you. Ivory stared at the folder without touching it. Why now? Why a year later? Because it took me this long to understand that apologizing isn't about making myself feel better. It's about acknowledging harm done and trying to do better going forward. I can't undo the past, can't give you back the childhood you deserved, but I can make sure no other wolf in Shadowmere faces what you faced. He stood to leave, clearly not expecting forgiveness or reconciliation. I'm not asking you to accept the apology. I'm not asking for relationship or contact. I just needed you to know that you were right about everything. And I was wrong about everything. Your father would be proud of the woman you've become. I'm sorry I couldn't see it sooner. Ivory watched him walk toward the door, felt her alphas tense, ready to follow if she gave any signal of distress. But instead of fear or anger, she felt something unexpected. Peace. Valen. He turned back, the whiskey-colored eyes cautious. I forgive you. The words came easier than she'd expected, felt lighter. Not because you deserve it, not because what you did was okay, but because I'm choosing to let go of the weight I've been carrying. You tried to protect me the only way you knew how. It was the wrong way. But it came from a real promise to someone you loved. That doesn't excuse the harm, but it explains it. And I'm choosing to move forward without that anger weighing me down. Valen's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Thank you. Don't thank me. Just do better. For the next Omega who needs real protection instead of control. For the next wolf who doesn't fit the standard pattern. Be the alpha I needed when I was 12 and being bullied. Not the alpha who tried to force me into a bond at 19. I will, he promised quietly. I swear it. After he left, Thorn slid into the seat across from her. How do you feel? Ivory considered the question carefully. Lighter, she said finally. Like I've been carrying Shadowmere on my shoulders and finally set it down. Valen wasn't a villain, he was just a man who made terrible choices trying to honor a promise. Understanding that doesn't mean forgiving everything, but it means I can stop being angry. You're extraordinary, Thorn said with fierce conviction. Do you know that most wolves would hold on to that rage forever? You're choosing to let it go. Because rage is heavy, Ivory said simply, and I want to travel light. 18 months after the bonding that changed everything, Ivory Winter's nightshade stood in the bathroom of the home she shared with 3 alphas and stared at a positive pregnancy test. Her hands trembled slightly as she set it on the counter. This wasn't planned. She'd been taking precautions, had assumed there would be more time before starting a family, before adding the complexity of children to the already complicated dynamics of a 4-person bond. But apparently the moon goddess had other plans. Ivory pressed one hand against her still, flat stomach and felt something shift inside her chest. Terror and joy in equal measure. This child would be wanted, protected, loved by 3 fathers who would die before letting harm touch their family. Raised in a pack that valued differences rather than fearing them. Taught that strength came in many forms, and none of them required fitting a standard pattern. This child would have everything Ivory hadn't. The realization made her throat tight. She walked into the living room where her 3 alphas were arguing about what to watch on television, with the kind of casual affection that came from years of knowing each other intimately. They looked up as she entered. All 3 immediately focused on her with laser intensity. What's wrong? Zephyr asked, already calculating threats and solutions. Are you hurt? Thorn was on his feet, moving toward her with predatory grace. Do you need anything? Caius's gentle voice carried concern. Ivory smiled despite tears streaming down her face. I'm pregnant. The silence that followed was deafening. Then chaos. Thorn lifted her off her feet with a roar of triumph. Zephyr was calculating due dates and necessary preparations. Caius was already researching prenatal care and Omega pregnancy complications. They were terrified and ecstatic and absolutely certain this was the best possible news. Just like Ivory. That night, curled in bed with 3 alphas surrounding her protectively, Ivory thought about the journey that had led here. From the rejected Omega who believed she was worthless, to the woman carrying a child who would be cherished beyond measure. From breakthrough heat that nearly killed her, to bonding that gave her everything she'd ever wanted. From believing she'd never shift, to discovering her white wolf when it mattered most. She also thought about Isla's letter that had arrived last month. Short, honest. Her sister working as rogue, struggling but growing. Asking not for forgiveness, but for the chance to rebuild trust slowly through letters. Ivory had responded with cautious openness. Boundaries firmly in place, but door left slightly ajar for possibility. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness. "For what?" Caius asked sleepily. "For seeing me when no one else did. For choosing me when I couldn't choose myself. For giving me a family when I thought I'd always be alone." Thorn's arms tightened around her. "We didn't give you anything you didn't already deserve. We just recognized what everyone else was too blind to see. You were always extraordinary, Ivory. We just had the privilege of loving you." And there it was, the truth she'd spent 19 years searching for. She wasn't extraordinary because three alphas had chosen her. Three alphas had chosen her because she'd always been extraordinary. The moon goddess had known exactly what she was doing when she'd created an albino omega who would survive breakthrough heat alone, who would reject arranged mating despite pressure, who would build independence from nothing, who would emerge as a white wolf exactly when her pack needed protection. Ivory Winter's nightshade had never been defective. She'd been blessed, and finally completely she believed it. Outside the full moon illuminated packlands where wolves ran free, where differences were celebrated rather than shamed, where an omega who'd spent her whole life being told she was less had become the standard that others aspired to reach. This was her story. This was her triumph. This was her forever. And it was perfect.